Before viewing video lessons, it is important to read the textbook using the learning guide as your turn-by-turn directions. Then use the learning guide to take organized notes in your own words with examples and pictures. Chapter 3, The Biological Bases of Behavior. In Chapter 3, we have been focusing on the biological piece of the biopsychosocial model of human behavior. So far, we've talked a lot about anatomy and physiology of the nervous system and endocrine system. There's one last piece we want to look at, and that is genetics, or how heredity can potentially influence behavior. We're going to start by focusing on heredity. This requires a little bit of background in genetics. Hopefully this is a review for you. So some of the basic principles of genetics are that within our cells, we have chromosomes. Most human cells, except for your sex cells, contain 46 chromosomes in pairs. So 23 pairs of chromosomes. On each chromosome are thousands of genes that are also paired up. These genes contain the DNA, or genetic information. DNA is simply the chemical instructions for how to build the body and how that body should function. Now, most of us, when we first learned about genetics, probably learned about it in a very simplistic way. Maybe you remember Mendel and his peas, or looking at brown eyes versus blue eyes. And usually we kind of focus on just one particular piece of DNA controlling one particular trait. What we've actually discovered, though, is that most human traits are not the result of just one gene, but they're actually polygenic. This means that they are controlled by more than one gene, and that these genes can interact with one another, and that those genes are also interacting with the environment. So if you want to try to examine if genes play a role in human behavior, the answer is much more complicated than a simple yes or no question, because we are more than just our genes. So the way that we have tried to examine this question of do people behave the way they do because of their genetics or inheritance is by looking at behavioral genetics. And we've pretty much just looked at this in terms of family studies. So we've looked to see, does that particular psychological trait or behavioral trait run in the family? So we might ask something like, does intelligence run in the family? So what we might do is find Albert Einstein's children and grandchildren and look to see if they're super intelligent just like him. In fact, we've done this. And what we found was that, while his children were not unintelligent, they were not geniuses like him. So this suggests that maybe there's more to intelligence than genetics, but it doesn't really give us a very satisfactory answer. Even when a trait runs in the family, it doesn't necessarily mean that's genetic. Let's say I have an anxiety disorder, and my mom has an anxiety disorder, and her mom had an anxiety disorder, and her mom had an anxiety disorder, and we find that, wow, this certainly runs in the family. But what it doesn't tell us is if it runs in the family because of a gene that we've passed from one generation to the next, or if it runs in the family because the way our family parents children teaches them to be anxious. So family studies don't give us very satisfactory answers. Now, something that gets closer are twin studies and adoption studies. Twin studies are the best because what we like to do is try to compare identical or mono from a single zygotic twins That means they have roughly 100% shared DNA, to fraternal or dizygotic from two zygotes, twins. And so if we look at the degrees of genetic relatedness, what we see is that fraternal twins only have about 50% shared DNA. This is the same amount of DNA that you share with a brother or sister that's not a twin, or the amount of DNA you may share with your parent or your child. So if we look at twin studies and we find that identical twins are more similar on a trait than fraternal twins, that gives us some indication of the degree of genetic contribution to that trait. Another way we've looked at this is with adoption studies. In adoption studies, we will take an adopted child and we will compare them to their biological parents who gave them their DNA, and to their adoptive parents who did not give them any DNA but did give them their environment. If we find the adopted child is more like the biological parents on a trait than the adoptive parents, that suggests that that trait is more influenced by genetics. If they're more like the adoptive family, then that suggests that that trait is more influenced by environment. But again, this makes things kind of messy to look at. So let's look at some data and see how well we can figure this question out. So the blue lines represent how similar the identical twins were on that particular trait. The yellow, goldish, orangish lines are the fraternal twins, which again only have about 50% shared DNA. So what we can see here is that for both intelligence and for the personality trait of extroversion, the identical twins are more similar to one another than the fraternal twins are. But in neither case are they exactly 100% the same. So what I can tell from this data is that this much of intelligence and this much of extroversion is related to personality or is related to genetics. What I can tell about this portion of your personality and this portion of your intelligence is that that piece is related to your environment. Now the parts where the two overlap, it's some combination of genetics and environment. And so trying to answer the question of whether or not you are this way because of your genes or because of your environment is pretty complicated. And so when we really look at this question, what we find is that both the environment and heredity influence behavior. We are part a product of nature and part a product of nurture. We are both born this way and made this way. And that the nature or genetic component interacts with and influences our environment, and that in turn our environment actually influences our genetics and can control the expression of our genes. So it determines whether those genes get turned on or off, activated or inactivated. This principle is called epigenetics. Now before we finish looking at the influence of heredity on behavior, we want to look at it from an evolutionary perspective. So we've already discussed evolutionary psychology briefly in chapter 1, and now we want to look at the evolutionary basis of behavior. So as you know, Darwin was one of the originators of the idea of natural selection, which is the basis for evolution. And Darwin in evolutionary theory basically says that traits that aid in reproductive success, which also includes survival, are the key to the genes that you have today. So our ancestors that lived and were able to successfully reproduce, passed on their genes and therefore their traits to their offspring, which explains why we have the genes we have today. If an ancient human had a trait that was not conducive to reproductive success or did not even enable them to survive long enough to reproduce, then that trait would not get passed on and would not be part of our genome today. Now, most of you are probably familiar with this from the standpoint of physical traits, but evolutionary psychology also looks at behavioral traits. And they look at behavioral adaptations that increased our chance of reproduction and survival. And so a couple of examples of this that we study from an evolutionary standpoint are the fight or flight response. We mentioned this briefly in chapter 3. We're going to go into it in greater detail in the stress and health chapter. And this is this automatic response in the body when we encounter a danger. This particular behavioral trait helped our ancestors to survive, so it's part of our biology today. A couple of other examples are our taste preferences. Think about the types of food that people like the most. Salty foods, sweet foods, high-fat foods, high-calorie foods, junk foods. Why is it that we like these foods so much, even though we know they're not that good for us? Well, it has something to do with the kinds of tastes that helped our ancestors to survive. If our ancestors discovered a sweet-tasting plant material, like a fruit or a vegetable, that sweetness was a sign of ripeness and also a sign that it was filled with good nutrients. So our ancestors that preferred those foods got better nourishment and were better able to survive. Today, unfortunately, I have too much availability of sweet foods. And sweet isn't always an indication of something filled with nutrients. Other areas that evolutionary psychology studies is parenting behaviors and how the way we parent has been influenced by our ancestors' adaptations, and also the way we choose mates and the types of relationships we have with those significant others. We'll talk a little bit about that when we are in the chapter on social behavior.